Hi, my name is Margaret Stone. I live in Cedar Falls, Iowa. This is my story. Mom, you really don't need to keep all these old photo albums. Nobody looks at physical photos anymore. My daughter Sarah was standing in my living room, holding a dusty box I'd pulled from the attic. Her perfectly manicured nails drummed impatiently against the cardboard. These aren't just photos, honey. They're memories. I reached for the box, but she pulled it back slightly. Memories take up space, Mom. And this house has way too much stuff. She glanced around my modest two-bedroom home with that expression I'd grown to recognize over the past few months. The same look she gave cluttered store displays, or old people who walked too slowly. I'd raised Sarah alone after her father died in a construction accident. When she was 12, 23 years of single motherhood, working double shifts at the textile factory. Saving every penny so she could go to college, become the lawyer she always dreamed of being. Now she was 35, successful, married to a financial advisor named Marcus, and living in a glass house in the suburbs of Des Moines. Sarah, this is my home. I like my things where they are. That's exactly the problem. She set the box down with a thud that made me wince. Marcus and I have been talking. This house is too big for one person. The property taxes alone are eating up your retirement income. Something cold settled in my stomach. What are you suggesting? We found this beautiful senior community about 20 minutes from our house. Independent living, but with support when you need it. Much more practical. The word practical hung in the air like smoke from a fire. You can't quite locate. I'd heard her use that word a lot lately. Practical, efficient, sensible, all the words that seemed to have no room for sentiment or attachment. Or the simple human need to stay rooted in familiar soil. I don't need support, Sarah. I need my garden. I need my neighbors. I need my life. Mom, be reasonable. You're 72. What happens if you fall down those basement stairs? What happens if you have another episode like last month? Last month, the dizzy spell that had landed me in the emergency room for 4 hours of tests. That revealed nothing more than mild dehydration and stress. Sarah had driven down from Des Moines in a panic, and I'd foolishly been grateful for her concern. Now I realized it hadn't been concern at all. It had been reconnaissance. That was nothing serious. It was a warning sign. And you know Dad would want us to be smart about this. There it was. The trump card she always played when she wanted something. What your father would have wanted. As if she had some special hotline to heaven. Some direct access to James's thoughts that I, his wife of 31 years, somehow lacked. Your father would want me to be happy. Your father would want you to be safe. She pulled out her phone, swiping through what looked like real estate listings. I already scheduled a tour for Thursday. Just to look. The place has a beautiful common room, organized activities, meal plans. Meal plans. I repeated the words like they were a foreign language. Sarah, I've been cooking my own meals since I was 10 years old. And now you can take a break from all that responsibility. Isn't that nice? Nice. Practical. Sensible. Her vocabulary for my future was getting smaller by the conversation. I walked to the kitchen window and looked out at my backyard. The tomato plants were heavy with fruit, and the marigolds I'd planted along the fence were bright orange and yellow against the late afternoon sun. James had built that fence with his own hands 28 years ago. When Sarah was 7 and wanted a dog. We never did get the dog, but the fence remained, weathered and sturdy, marking the boundaries of the only home Sarah had ever known until she left for college. This house has been in our family for 34 years, I said, not turning around. And it's served its purpose. But purposes change, Mom. Needs evolve. I heard her moving behind me. Probably straightening things, making mental lists of what needed to be discarded, donated, sold. She'd always been organized, even as a child. Color-coded notebooks, perfectly planned schedules. A place for everything and everything in its place. I'd been proud of those qualities once. Now they felt like weapons aimed at my heart. The equity in this house could fund a very comfortable retirement for you. Much more comfortable than struggling to maintain a property this size on a fixed income. I'm not struggling. The roof needs work. The furnace is 20 years old. The driveway has cracks you could lose a small animal in. She was warming to her topic now, building her case like the lawyer she was. Marcus ran the numbers. Between property taxes, maintenance, utilities, and insurance, you're spending 60% of your monthly income just to keep this place running. It's my place to run. For now, but what about next year? Or the year after that? What happens when the big repairs start coming? A new roof is $15,000 minimum. A furnace replacement is another $8,000. And that's assuming you don't need any medical care beyond your regular Medicare coverage. The numbers felt like stones dropping into still water, each one sending ripples of anxiety through my chest. I'd worked so hard to be financially responsible, to never be a burden on my only child. But Sarah was talking about my future, like it was a business plan with declining profit margins. I could take out a reverse mortgage. Mom, no, those are financial traps. You'd end up owing more than the house is worth. She came to stand beside me at the window. And for a moment, I caught a glimpse of the little girl who used to help me plant seeds in this same garden. I know this is hard. Change is always hard, but sometimes the people who love us have to make the difficult decisions. Because we're too close to the situation to see clearly. Too close to my own life to see clearly. You know that's not what I meant. But it was exactly what she meant. I could hear it in the careful patience of her voice. The same tone she probably used with difficult clients who refused to accept sensible plea bargains. I was becoming a case to be managed, a problem to be solved. An elderly woman whose attachment to her own home was an inconvenient obstacle to a more efficient arrangement. Thursday at 2 o'clock, she continued. Promise me you'll at least look at the place. I watched a cardinal land on the fence post, where James used to hang his work gloves every evening when he came home. The bird stayed for just a moment before flying away. A flash of red against the weathered wood. I promise I'll think about it. It wasn't the promise she wanted, but it was all I could give. Sarah squeezed my shoulder, and for just a moment, her touch felt like love instead of management. That's all I ask. Just keep an open mind. After she left, I sat in James's old recliner and looked around the living room. Every piece of furniture told a story. The coffee table he'd built in the garage. During the winter Sarah turned 16. The bookshelf that had held her school photos. Swimming trophies, debate team awards. The lamp we'd bought during our honeymoon in Branson, Missouri. 35 years ago. Too much stuff, Sarah had said. But stuff was just another word for evidence. Evidence that we had lived here, loved here. Built something that mattered within these walls. I picked up the photo album Sarah had wanted to throw away. And opened it to a picture of her at age 8. Gap-toothed and grinning, standing in front of the fence James had just finished building. She was holding a sign she'd made with markers. And poster board, Sarah's house. Even then, she'd understood the concept of ownership, of belonging. Somewhere specific and permanent. When had she forgotten that belonging was about more than just efficiency and practical arrangements? The phone rang, startling me from my thoughts. It was my neighbor, Dorothy Wilson, calling to ask if I'd seen her cat. Whiskers got out again, she said. I swear that animal has more escape routes than a Prison Break movie. I'll keep an eye out, I promised. Check the garden shed. He likes to sleep on the old lawn chair cushions. You're an angel, Maggie. What would we do without you? What would we do without you? Such a simple question, but it echoed in my mind long after Dorothy hung up. What would my neighbors do without me? What would my garden do without me? What would this house do without me? And perhaps most importantly, what would I do without all of them? I closed the photo album and held it against my chest, listening to the familiar sounds of my home settling around me. The refrigerator's gentle hum, the tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway. The creak of floorboards that had learned. The pattern of my footsteps over 3 decades. These weren't just the sounds of a house that needed updating and efficient management. They were the sounds of a life still being lived. Still full of purpose and connection and the quiet dignity of independence. Thursday at 2 o'clock, Sarah had said. Just to look. But I already knew what I would see. I would see a place where someone else decided. When I ate, what activities I should enjoy, how much space one old woman really needed. I would see the end of choosing for myself. Wrapped up in the language of care and concern and practical arrangements. Outside, the cardinal returned to the fence post, this time bringing its mate. They sat together for several minutes, 2 bright spots of color against the evening sky. before flying away together toward whatever nest they had built, whatever home they had chosen for themselves. I made myself a cup of tea and sat back down with the photo album, turning slowly through the pages of Sarah's childhood, looking for clues about when exactly my daughter had stopped believing that some things were worth keeping just because they mattered. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning while I was deadheading the roses. Sarah's voice had an edge to it that made my stomach tighten immediately. "Mom, I need you to sit down. I'm in the garden, honey." "What's wrong?" "Please, just go inside and sit down. This is important." I brushed the dirt off my hands and walked slowly to the kitchen, that cold feeling from our last conversation returning with interest. Through the window, I could see Dorothy Wilson walking her little terrier. And everything looked so normal. So unchanged from 5 minutes ago when the world still made sense. "I'm sitting," I said, settling into the chair at my kitchen table. "Marcus and I have been doing some research. And we found some information about the senior community I mentioned. Sunset Gardens. Mom, there's a waiting list, and they just had a cancellation. We could get you a spot immediately, but we have to move fast." "Sarah, I told you I'd think about it. It's been 4 days. I know, but opportunities like this don't come along often. The unit that's available is perfect for you. Ground floor, garden view, close to all the amenities." I stared at the sugar bowl in the center of my table. The one James had given me for our 5th anniversary. It was painted with tiny blue flowers, and over the years, the pattern had faded in spots where my fingers had traced it. While I drank my morning coffee and planned my days. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" "I'm asking you to trust me. Marcus has already run the financial projections. If we list your house now, we can close by the end of September. That gives us just enough time to get you settled at Sunset Gardens before winter." The words hit me like cold water. List my house? Sarah, I never agreed to sell my house. "Mom, we've been over this. The house is too big, too expensive to maintain. This is the practical solution." There was that word again. Practical. But this time it sounded different. This time it sounded like a decision that had already been made without me. "I want to see this place before we discuss selling anything." "Of course. I've scheduled us a tour for this afternoon at 3. I'll pick you up at 2:30. This afternoon?" The speed of everything was making me dizzy. "Sarah, you can't just reorganize my entire life in a single phone call." "I'm not reorganizing your life. I'm helping you transition to the next phase. There's a difference." But her voice had the same crisp efficiency she used when discussing cases with her colleagues. And I realized that's exactly what I had become. A case with a clear problem. And an obvious solution, complicated only by the client's emotional resistance to good advice. "What if I don't like it?" "You will. I've done all the research. They have gardening clubs, book clubs, movie nights, exercise classes designed specifically for seniors. You'll have more social interaction than you've had in years." Social interaction. As if my current life was somehow deficient. Lacking in meaningful human connection. I thought about Dorothy Wilson asking for help. Finding her cat, about the young mother next door, who sometimes brought her toddler over to see the flowers, about Mr. Peterson who borrowed my hedge trimmers every spring, and always returned them clean and sharp. I have social interaction, Sarah. I have friends here. You have acquaintances. People you wave to across the yard or chat with at the grocery store. At Sunset Gardens, you'll have built-in community, organized activities. People who share your interests and life stage. People who share your life stage. The phrase made me feel like I was being sorted into some kind of demographic category. Filed away with other women my age, who had outlived their usefulness in the world of younger, more practical people. The doorbell rang, and I felt a surge of relief at the interruption. "Someone's at the door," I said. "We can talk about the details when I pick you up." 2:30, Mom. This is really going to be wonderful for you." She hung up before I could respond, leaving me staring at the phone like it might ring again. And someone different would be on the other end. Someone who sounded like my daughter. But understood that wonderful was something I got to define for myself. The doorbell rang again, and I went to answer it, expecting to find Dorothy or the mail carrier. Or maybe the teenager from 3 houses down selling something for school. Instead, I found a man I didn't recognize, tall and silver-haired. wearing khakis and a blue button-down shirt that looked expensive but not flashy. Mrs. Stone? My name is Robert Chen. I'm a real estate agent with Hartwell Properties. I believe your daughter contacted our office about listing your home. The world tilted slightly to the left. I'm sorry, what? Your daughter, Sarah, called our office yesterday. She said you were interested in selling and moving to a senior living community. She asked me to stop by and do a preliminary assessment, so we could discuss pricing and timing. Yesterday, while I was still processing the idea of maybe, possibly, someday considering a change. Sarah had already been making phone calls, setting wheels in motion, treating my tentative promise to think about it as a green light to proceed. There's been a misunderstanding, I managed. I haven't decided to sell my house. Robert Chen's smile faltered slightly. He glanced at a folder in his hand, then back at me. Oh, I apologize. Your daughter seemed quite certain that you were ready to move forward. She mentioned that time was a factor. Because of the availability at the senior community. She mentioned a lot of things, apparently. Would you like me to reschedule? Perhaps after you've had more time to discuss the details with your daughter? I looked past him at my front yard, at the flower beds I'd planted and replanted over the years, at the walkway where James and I used to sit on summer evenings and watch Sarah ride her bike up and down the sidewalk. A for sale sign in this yard was unimaginable. Like trying to picture someone else's furniture in my living room or another woman cooking in my kitchen. Mr. Chen, I appreciate you coming by, but I'm not ready to sell. I may never be ready to sell. My daughter is. She's concerned about me living alone. But her concerns don't override my right to make my own decisions about my own life. He nodded, and his expression shifted from professional disappointment to something warmer, more human. Mrs. Stone, if I may say so, I've been in this business for 22 years. I've helped a lot of families navigate situations like this. Sometimes the people who love us get so focused on what they think is best for us that they forget to ask what we actually want. Exactly. On the other hand, sometimes we get so attached to maintaining our independence that we resist changes that might actually improve our quality of life. I studied his face, looking for signs that he was just another person trying to manage me toward a predetermined conclusion. Instead, I saw someone who seemed genuinely interested in the truth. Whatever it might be. Would you like to come in for a cup of coffee? I heard myself ask. I'd like that very much. We sat at my kitchen table, and I found myself telling this stranger about the phone call from Sarah. About the speed with which my future was being planned. Without my input, about the feeling that I was being treated like a problem to be solved, rather than a person with valid feelings about her own life. It sounds like your daughter loves you very much, Robert said. After I'd finished. I know she does. That's what makes this so difficult. Have you told her how all of this makes you feel? I've tried, but she has statistics and financial projections and logical arguments for every concern I raise. How do you argue with spreadsheets? You don't argue with spreadsheets. You argue with the assumption that life is a spreadsheet. I stared at him. That's very wise. My mother went through something similar with my sister 5 years ago. Different details, same dynamic. My sister was convinced that mom needed to move to assisted living. Mom was convinced she was fine where she was. They spent 6 months locked in this battle of wills, both of them miserable. What happened? Mom moved to assisted living. My heart sank. Oh, but here's the important part. She moved because she finally decided she wanted to. Not because my sister pressured her into it. It took some time, and it took some honest conversations about what she was really afraid of. But eventually she realized that holding on to her house had become more of a burden than a joy. And she's happy there? Very. But she might not have been if she'd been pushed into it before she was ready. Robert finished his coffee and stood to leave. At the door, he handed me his business card. Mrs. Stone, if you ever do decide you want to explore your options, I'd be happy to help. But only if and when you decide. Not your daughter, not me, not anyone else. You. After he left, I walked through my house slowly, looking at it with new eyes. Was I holding on to it because it truly made me happy? Or was I holding on to it because selling it felt like admitting defeat? Accepting that the best years of my life were behind me? In Sarah's old bedroom, I stood in front of the window she used to sneak out of during high school. The one that looked out over the backyard, where she'd had her first kiss under the apple tree James planted the year she was born. The room was exactly as she'd left it when she moved out after law school. As if I'd been keeping it as a shrine to the daughter who used to need me, who used to ask my advice instead of giving it. Maybe that was part of the problem. Maybe Sarah was trying to parent me the same way I'd parented her, making decisions based on what I thought was best, not what she actually wanted. Maybe we'd somehow traded roles without either of us noticing. And now we were both confused about who was supposed to be taking care of whom. At 2:30 exactly, Sarah's car pulled into my driveway. I watched her check her phone, reapply her lipstick, and gather what looked like a folder full of documents from the passenger seat. She was prepared for this appointment. The way she prepared for court appearances, with facts and figures and persuasive arguments. But as I locked my front door and walked toward her car, I realized I was prepared too. Not with spreadsheets or statistics, but with something Sarah had taught me long ago. When she was small and testing boundaries, the simple but powerful word, no. The Sunset Gardens lobby looked like a hotel, designed by someone who had never actually stayed in a hotel. Everything was beige and sage green, with fake plants that managed to look both perfectly maintained and somehow lifeless. Soft jazz played from hidden speakers, and the air smelled like disinfectant disguised with vanilla air freshener. "Isn't this lovely?" Sarah said, her voice bright, with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for convincing toddlers that vegetables taste like candy. "Look at those beautiful windows. So much natural light." I looked. The windows were large, I'd give her that. But they faced the parking lot and a busy 4-lane road beyond it. Natural light, yes, but not exactly a garden view. Mrs. Stone, a woman in a navy blue suit, approached us with the kind of smile that probably hurt her face by the end of each workday. "I'm Jennifer Walsh, the Community Relations Coordinator. Your daughter has told me so much about you. I understand you're interested in joining our family here at Sunset Gardens." "I'm interested in looking," I said carefully. "Of course, looking is the first step. And I think you're going to love what you see." Jennifer led us through a maze of hallways that all looked identical, except for the small plaques next to each door indicating room numbers. The carpet was industrial grade, designed to hide stains and show no personality whatsoever. "This is our main dining hall," Jennifer announced, gesturing to a large room filled with round tables and chairs that looked like they'd been ordered from a hotel supply catalog. "We serve 3 meals a day, and our chef prepares everything fresh. No more worrying about grocery shopping or meal planning." A few elderly residents sat scattered throughout the room, some reading newspapers, others staring out the windows with the glazed expression of people who had run out of interesting things to think about. "What if someone wants to cook for themselves occasionally?" I asked. "Well, each unit has a kitchenette with a small refrigerator and microwave. But honestly, most of our residents find it liberating not to have to worry about cooking anymore." Liberating. Another word that sounded like freedom but felt like the opposite. "Mom, think about it," Sarah said. "No more meal planning, no more grocery shopping, no more dishes to wash. You could spend your time on things you actually enjoy. I enjoy cooking. You enjoy the idea of cooking. But I see how tired you get trying to keep up with everything." I wanted to argue, but Jennifer was already ushering us toward the next stop on our tour. A recreation room where several residents were watching television with the volume turned up loud enough to wake the dead. "We have organized activities every day," Jennifer explained. "Bingo on Mondays, craft time on Tuesdays, movie afternoons on Wednesdays. Exercise classes on Thursdays and music programs on Fridays. Weekends are for family visits and special events." What if someone doesn't want to participate in organized activities? "Oh, everyone loves our activities. It's one of the things that makes Sunset Gardens such a special community." Residents often tell us they're busier here than they ever were in their own homes. Busy, but busy doing what other people had decided they should be doing, on a schedule other people had created, with people other people had chosen for them. "Here's a unit very similar to the one that's available," Jennifer said, unlocking a door marked 247. "As you can see, it's very comfortable and efficient." The apartment was small but clean, with a tiny living room A bedroom barely large enough for a double bed, and the kitchenette Jennifer had mentioned, which consisted of a 2-burner stove, a compact refrigerator, and about 3 feet of counter space. Where would I put my furniture? I asked. Most residents find that downsizing is actually quite freeing, Jennifer said. We have a list of estate sale companies that can help with the transition. Estate sale. The words hit me like a slap. Estate sales were for dead people or people preparing to be dead. Mom, you don't need all that furniture anyway, Sarah said. Most of it's old and worn out. This would be a perfect opportunity to start fresh. Get some nice new pieces that fit the space. I walked to the window and looked out at the courtyard. A small square of grass surrounded by more beige buildings. A few residents sat on benches, but no one was talking. They looked like people waiting for something that wasn't going to come. The available unit has a lovely garden view, Jennifer said, following my gaze. Very peaceful and serene. Peaceful and serene, or empty and isolated. From here, I couldn't see a single flower. Just professionally maintained grass and a few decorative shrubs. That looked like they'd been chosen more for their ability to survive neglect than for their beauty. What about pets? I asked, thinking suddenly of Dorothy, Wilson's cat, of the birds that visited my feeders. Every morning, of the life that pulsed through my neighborhood. In ways that had nothing to do with scheduled activities and organized entertainment. We have a no pets policy. But we do have visiting therapy animals once a month. Once a month. It's actually quite popular. The residents look forward to it. Once a month, someone else's animal would visit to provide a carefully measured dose of the companionship and connection that used to be part of daily life. I'd like to see more, I said. Of course. Let me show you the wellness center. The wellness center was a small room with a few pieces of exercise equipment that looked like they'd been designed for people who might break if they exerted themselves too vigorously. A physical therapist was working with an elderly man who was lifting weights that couldn't have weighed more than 3 pounds each. We have a full-time wellness coordinator who designs personalized exercise programs for each resident, Jennifer explained. Safety is our top priority. Safety. The word that was starting to sound like a cage made of good intentions. And if someone wanted to take walks outside the building? We have beautiful grounds, and residents are welcome to walk anywhere within the community. For longer outings, we provide scheduled transportation to shopping centers and doctor's appointments. Scheduled transportation to approved destinations, with other people's timetables determining when and where I could go. What about independence? I asked. What if someone wants to drive their own car, come and go as they please? Jennifer's smile flickered slightly. Many of our residents find that giving up driving is actually a relief. No more worrying about traffic or parking or maintaining a vehicle. But what if they don't find it a relief? Well, we do have a small parking area for residents who still drive. But honestly, most people discover they don't need their cars anymore. Once they're settled here, most people discover, or most people give up hoping for anything different. The tour continued through a library that was smaller than my living room, a computer center with 4 ancient terminals, and a hair salon that operated 2 days a week. Everything was clean, organized, and efficient. Everything was designed to meet the basic needs of people whose needs had been determined by someone else. I think we've seen enough, Sarah said as we finished the tour. Mom, what do you think? Isn't it perfect? Perfect. The word hung in the air like a question. I couldn't answer honestly without hurting her feelings. It's very nice, I said carefully. The unit won't be available for long, Jennifer warned. We have a waiting list, and opportunities like this are rare. How long do I have to decide? Well, ideally, we'd need an answer within the week. Sooner if possible. A week to decide whether to give up the life I'd built over 7 decades. A week to choose between my daughter's vision of my future and my own stubborn attachment to the past. On the drive home, Sarah chattered about floor plans and meal options and activity schedules. But I found myself looking out the window at the neighborhoods we passed, at the houses with gardens and swing sets and evidence of lives being lived rather than managed. You're awfully quiet, Sarah said as we turned into my driveway. I'm thinking. About what? I thought it was obvious that Sunset Gardens would be perfect for you. I looked at my house, at the roses climbing the trellis James had built, at the porch Where I drank my morning coffee and watched the world wake up at the mailbox. Where Dorothy Wilson's cat liked to sit and survey his domain. Sarah, can I ask you something? Of course. When you were little, and you wanted something I didn't think was a good idea, how did you feel when I said no? She turned off the car and gave me a puzzled look. I don't understand what you're asking. You used to beg for things. A later bedtime, a puppy, permission to go to parties. I thought you were too young for. And when I said no, you'd argue with me. You'd tell me all the reasons why I was wrong, why your way was better. Do you remember how that felt? Mom, that's completely different. I was a child. You're an adult. Am I? Because this conversation feels very familiar. You've decided what's best for me. And now you're trying to convince me to agree with you. But what if I don't agree? What if I think my way is better? Your way is keeping you isolated. And struggling financially in a house that's too big for you. My way is staying in the place I love, with the people I care about. Making my own choices about how I want to spend whatever time I have left. We sat in silence for a moment. The weight of unspoken words filling the car like smoke. I'm trying to help you, Sarah said finally. I know you are, but maybe I don't need the kind of help you're offering. So what do you need? I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the little girl. Who used to bring me dandelions from the yard. Who used to help me make cookies on rainy Saturday afternoons. Who used to trust me to know the difference between what was safe and what was right. I need you to trust me the way I trusted you when you were growing up. I need you to believe that I might know something about my own life. That your spreadsheets and statistics can't capture. And if you're wrong, if something happens to you, because I wasn't brave enough to insist on the practical solution, there it was again, practical, the word that had become a weapon she used against my heart. Then at least I'll have lived my life on my own terms until the very end. Isn't that what you'd want for yourself? Sarah didn't answer, but I could see her thinking, could see her lawyer's mind. Working through the implications of my question. I love you, honey, I said, opening the car door. But I'm not ready to give up my life. Just because you're afraid of what might happen if I keep living it. I walked to my front door without looking back, but I could feel her watching me, could sense her. Trying to decide whether to follow me inside and continue the argument. Or drive away and regroup for the next round. The sound of her car starting told me she'd chosen to regroup. Inside my house, I walked from room to room, looking at everything with fresh eyes. Was this place a prison that trapped me in the past? Or was it a foundation that grounded me in the present? Was I holding on out of stubbornness? Or was I holding on because some things were worth holding on to? I didn't have answers yet, but for the first time in weeks. I felt like the questions were mine to ask. 3 days passed without a word from Sarah. 3 days of unusual quiet, of no phone calls asking about my decision. No surprise visits with more brochures and logical arguments. I should have been relieved, but instead, I felt the peculiar anxiety that comes when you're waiting for the other shoe to drop. On Friday morning, the shoe dropped with a knock at my door. At exactly 9 o'clock, Mrs. Stone? The woman standing on my porch looked like she could have been Sarah's older sister. All business suits and clipboards and efficient smiles. My name is Linda Morrison. I'm with Adult Protective Services. The world seemed to tilt sideways. I'm sorry, what? We received a call expressing concern about your welfare. May I come in? I stood frozen in my doorway, trying to process what was happening. Adult Protective Services. The kind of agency that got involved when elderly people were being neglected or abused. When they couldn't take care of themselves. When they needed someone else to make decisions for them. Who called you? I'm not at liberty to discuss the specific source of the referral. But I can tell you that someone who cares about you is worried about your safety and well-being. Someone who cares about me. The phrase sounded exactly like something Sarah would say when she wanted to justify doing something I didn't want her to do. There's been a misunderstanding, I said. I'm fine. I don't need any services. I'm sure you are fine, Mrs. Stone. This is just a routine wellness check. If you could spare a few minutes to answer some questions, I can put everyone's mind at ease. Linda Morrison's voice had the same professional warmth as Jennifer Walsh at Sunset Gardens. The same tone that said she was here to help whether I wanted help or not. I let her in because refusing would only make me look more like someone who had something to hide. Someone whose judgment couldn't be trusted. What a lovely home, she said, looking around my living room with eyes that seemed to catalog every detail. How long have you lived here? 34 years. And you live alone? Yes, since my husband died 10 years ago. She made a note on her clipboard. Everything I said was being recorded, evaluated, measured against some standard. I didn't know and couldn't meet if I tried. Do you have family nearby? My daughter lives in Des Moines. About 2 hours away. And how often do you see her? Often enough. The defensive edge in my voice surprised me. But Linda Morrison didn't seem surprised at all. She just made another note. Mrs. Stone, I understand there's been some discussion about your living situation. About whether this house might be too difficult for you to maintain on your own. There's been discussion, yes. But discussion doesn't mean agreement. Can you tell me about your daily routine? How do you manage tasks like grocery shopping, housekeeping, paying bills? I felt like a student being tested on material I should have mastered years ago. I shop for groceries every Tuesday at the Hy-Vee on Elm Street. I clean my house the same way I've cleaned it for 34 years. I pay my bills on time, the same day every month. Do you ever feel confused or disoriented? Have trouble remembering things? I remember everything that matters. Have you had any recent health scares? Falls, dizzy spells, anything that might indicate you need additional support? The emergency room visit. Sarah had told them about the emergency room visit, probably described it as some kind of major medical event. Instead of the minor dehydration it had actually been. I had a dizzy spell last month. It turned out to be nothing serious. But it was serious enough to require emergency medical attention. It was serious enough that my daughter panicked and insisted on taking me to the hospital, where they gave me some IV fluids and sent me home. Linda Morrison made more notes, and I could see myself through her eyes. An elderly woman living alone, recently hospitalized. Resistant to family concerns about her safety, defensive about her ability to care for herself. On paper, I probably looked like exactly the kind of person who needed intervention. Mrs. Stone, no one is suggesting that you can't take care of yourself. But sometimes we all need a little extra support, especially as we get older. There's no shame in accepting help. I'm not ashamed of accepting help. I'm opposed to accepting help I don't need from people who won't listen. When I tell them I don't need it. Your daughter loves you very much. She's worried about you living alone in such a large house, managing all the responsibilities of homeownership on a fixed income. My daughter has decided what's best for me without asking what I want. There's a difference between love and control, even when the person doing the controlling has good intentions. Linda Morrison looked up from her clipboard, and for the first time, her professional mask slipped slightly. You sound like you have some strong feelings about your daughter's suggestions. I have strong feelings about anyone trying to make major life decisions for me without my consent. But surely you understand her concerns. This is a large house for one person. Maintenance, utilities, property taxes, these expenses can be overwhelming. On a retirement income, they can be. They're not, at least not yet. And when they become overwhelming, I'm perfectly capable of making my own decisions about how to handle that situation. What if you're not? What if your judgment becomes impaired, or you have a medical emergency? Or you simply can't manage the physical demands of maintaining this property? The questions felt like hammers, each one designed to chip away at my confidence, to make me doubt my own perceptions and capabilities. Then I'll deal with those problems when they actually exist, not when someone else imagines they might exist someday. We talked for another 20 minutes, covering everything from my medical history to my social connections to my financial situation. Linda Morrison was thorough, I'd give her that. But also surprisingly respectful. She didn't treat me like a confused old woman or an unreasonable burden. She treated me like someone whose opinions mattered, even if those opinions were causing problems for other people. Mrs. Stone, based on our conversation today, I don't see any immediate safety concerns. You're clearly competent to make your own decisions about your living situation. I felt a surge of relief so strong it made me dizzy. Thank you. However, I would encourage you to think seriously about your daughter's concerns. Family members who express worry about elderly relatives are usually responding to real observations and legitimate fears. And elderly people who resist pressure from well-meaning family members are usually responding to real desires for autonomy and dignity. She smiled, the first genuine expression I'd seen from her all morning. Fair enough, Mrs. Stone, if you ever do need resources or support services, please don't hesitate to call our office. We're here to help people maintain their independence, as long as safely possible. After she left, I sat in my kitchen and tried to process what had just happened. Sarah had called Adult Protective Services on me. My own daughter had reported me as a potentially incompetent elderly person who might need state intervention to protect her from her own poor judgment. The betrayal felt like a physical pain, sharp and breathless and completely unexpected, even though I should have seen it coming. This was what happened when love became infected with fear, when concern transformed into control, when someone decided that protecting you was more important than respecting you. I called Dorothy Wilson and asked if she wanted to come over for coffee. I needed to talk to someone who knew me as a neighbor and friend, not as a case to be managed or a problem to be solved. Of course, honey. I'll be right over. Dorothy arrived 15 minutes later with a plate of homemade oatmeal cookies. And the kind of no-nonsense sympathy that comes from 78 years of living through other people's crises. You look like someone ran over your dog, she said, settling into the chair across from me. I told her everything. The pressure from Sarah to move to Sunset Gardens, the real estate agent who'd shown up uninvited, the visit from Adult Protective Services. Dorothy listened without interrupting, occasionally shaking her head or making small sounds of disapproval. That girl needs her head examined, she said when I finished. Calling the county on her own mother. What's the world coming to? She thinks she's protecting me. She's protecting herself from having to worry about you. There's a difference. Dorothy had a way of cutting through emotional complications to get to the heart of things. A skill I'd always admired and desperately needed right now. Maybe she's right, though. Maybe I am being stubborn and unreasonable. Maybe I am too old to live alone in a house this size. Maggie Stone, I've known you for 26 years. You're one of the most capable, sensible people I've ever met. If you say you're fine living here, then you're fine living here. But what if something happens? What if I fall down the basement stairs? Or have another dizzy spell or can't afford a major repair? Then you'll handle it the same way. You've handled every other crisis in your life. With intelligence and grace and the help of people who actually care about what you want. Not just what they think you need. She reached across the table and patted my hand. Honey, getting older doesn't mean giving up the right to make mistakes. It doesn't mean letting other people bubble wrap your life to protect you from every possible risk. Living isn't safe. It never has been. Sarah says I'm being selfish. Sarah's the one being selfish. She wants you to rearrange your entire life so she can stop worrying about you. That's not love, Maggie. That's emotional blackmail. I knew Dorothy was right, but knowing didn't make the guilt go away. Sarah was my only child, my only family. If something did happen to me, she'd be the one dealing with the consequences, the one handling my affairs. The one living with whatever decisions I made or failed to make. She's all I have, I said. No, she isn't. You have friends, neighbors, a community of people who care about you. You have a life here that matters to more people than just Sarah. But if she cuts me off? If she decides I'm too difficult to deal with? Then she'll be the one missing out. Children don't get to hold their love hostage, just because their parents won't do what they want. Dorothy stayed for 2 hours, and by the time she left, I felt stronger, more centered, more certain that my instincts about my own life were worth trusting. That evening, Sarah called. Mom, I heard Linda Morrison stopped by today. Yes, she did. Did you expect her to report back to you directly? Or are you planning to wait for the official paperwork? Silence on the other end of the line. The kind of silence that meant Sarah was trying to decide how much truth she could afford to acknowledge. I was worried about you. You were trying to force my hand. That's not. Mom, I just wanted someone objective to assess the situation. Someone objective would have talked to me before making assumptions about what I need. Someone objective would have asked me how I felt about my living situation. Instead of deciding that my feelings were irrelevant. I never said your feelings were irrelevant. You didn't have to say it, Sarah. You demonstrated it by going behind my back and reporting me to the county. like I was some kind of neglected child. Another silence, longer this time. What did she tell you? Sarah asked finally. She told me exactly what I already knew. That I'm competent to make my own decisions about my own life. For now. For now is all any of us have. You don't get to plan for hypothetical future emergencies. By taking away my present autonomy. So what happens now? I looked around my kitchen, at the familiar walls and windows and the view of my garden. Where the tomatoes were finally starting to ripen. Now I live my life. In my house, on my terms, for as long as I can and want to. And if I can't accept that, then we both have some difficult decisions to make about what our relationship is going to look like going forward. It wasn't the conversation either of us had wanted to have, but it was the conversation we needed to have. After Sarah hung up, I sat in the quiet of my house and listened to all the familiar sounds that meant home, safety, belonging. Outside, a storm was building, dark clouds gathering in the west. But inside, everything was exactly where it belonged. Exactly where I wanted it to be. For the first time in weeks, that felt like enough. The storm that had been threatening all evening finally arrived around midnight, bringing with it the kind of wind and rain that made my old house creak and settle in ways that usually felt comforting but tonight seemed ominous. I lay in bed listening to the weather and thinking about my conversation with Sarah, wondering if I'd been too harsh, too uncompromising, too willing to damage our relationship for the sake of my own stubborn independence. At 3 in the morning, the power went out. I found my flashlight and made my way carefully downstairs, checking to see if it was just my house or the whole neighborhood. Through the living room window, I could see that Dorothy's house was dark too. And the street lamps were out. The whole block was without power. Probably the whole area given the severity of the storm. I wasn't worried. I'd lived through plenty of power outages over the years. And I knew how to manage. I had candles, a battery-powered radio, enough food in the refrigerator to last until the electricity came back on. I even had a camp stove James had bought years ago for emergencies. Just like this one. But as I sat in my kitchen by candlelight, listening to the wind howl around the corners of the house, I couldn't help thinking about what Sarah would say if she knew. This would be exactly the kind of situation she'd point to as evidence that I was too vulnerable, too isolated, too dependent on systems that could fail without warning. The phone rang, startling me so badly I nearly knocked over my coffee mug. The landline was still working, powered by the phone company's backup systems. Mom? Thank God you answered. I've been watching the weather reports. Are you okay? Sarah's voice was tight with anxiety, and despite everything that had happened between us, I felt a surge of gratitude that she'd called. I'm fine, honey. The power's out, but I have everything I need. The power's out? Mom, you can't stay there without electricity. What if the temperature drops? What if your pipes freeze? It's August, Sarah. The pipes aren't going to freeze. But what if the outage lasts for days? What if you run out of food or your medications go bad or you can't call for help? I could hear the panic building in her voice, could picture her pacing around her climate-controlled house in Des Moines, working herself up into the kind of crisis mode that made rational conversation impossible. Sarah, I've lived through dozens of power outages. I know how to take care of myself. This isn't about your capabilities, Mom. It's about being practical. Why suffer through this alone, when you could be safe and comfortable somewhere else? Because this is my home, and a temporary inconvenience doesn't change that. What if it's not temporary? What if this storm damaged the power lines severely? What if it takes weeks to restore electricity? What if? Sarah's mind was spinning through every possible disaster, every potential catastrophe that might justify her fears and validate her desire to remove me from any situation that contained even the smallest element of risk. Then I'll deal with that if and when it happens. Mom, please, just for tonight, let me come get you. You can stay with us until the power comes back on. The offer was tempting, I had to admit. Sarah and Marcus lived in a beautiful house with a generator and all the modern conveniences that would make riding out the storm much more comfortable. But comfort wasn't really what this was about. Sarah, if I leave every time something goes wrong, if I run to you for help every time I face a minor challenge, then I really will become the helpless old woman you seem to think I already am. You're not helpless. You're being unnecessarily stubborn. I'm being independent. There's a difference. We talked for another few minutes, Sarah growing more frustrated with my refusal to see reason, me growing more determined not to let her fears dictate my choices. Finally, she said she loved me and made me promise to call if I needed anything. And we hung up with the same tension that had been building between us for weeks. I spent the rest of the night reading by candlelight, listening to the storm gradually blow itself out. By dawn, the rain had stopped and the wind had died down to occasional gusts. The power was still out, but I could see through my kitchen window that several neighbors were already outside, checking for damage, sharing information, helping each other clear fallen branches from driveways. This was what Sarah couldn't see from 2 hours away. This was what would be lost if I moved to a place where all my problems were solved by paid staff and organized systems. The power outage wasn't a crisis to be managed by experts. It was a shared experience that brought people together, that reminded us we were part of a community. I made coffee on the camp stove and took a cup out to my front porch, where I found Dorothy Wilson surveying the large branch that had fallen across her driveway. "Morning, Maggie. Hell of a storm." "Morning, Dorothy. Looks like you're going to need some help with that branch." Already called my grandson. He'll be over this afternoon with his chainsaw. Mr. Peterson from next door appeared with a battery-powered radio, and we gathered around to listen to the local news. Power was expected to be restored by evening. No major damage reported, just the usual collection of fallen trees and minor flooding that came with summer storms. "Could have been worse," Mr. Peterson said. "Could have been better," Dorothy replied. "But this is what we get for living in tornado country." We talked for a while about the storm, about other storms we'd weathered over the years, about the time the power was out for 5 days after an ice storm in 2007. I realized that these conversations, these shared memories of challenges faced and overcome, were exactly what I would miss if I moved to a place where someone else was always responsible for handling emergencies. Around noon, a truck from the electric company pulled up to work on the power lines, and I felt a familiar sense of satisfaction at being right about something. The outage would be temporary, just as I'd told Sarah. The systems would be restored, normal life would resume, and I would have made it through another minor crisis without needing to be rescued. But as I watched the linemen working to restore our electricity, I found myself thinking about Sarah's questions from the night before. What if the outage had lasted longer? What if it had been winter instead of summer? What if I'd been sick or injured and unable to manage on my own? The truth was, I couldn't answer those questions with absolute certainty. None of us could. Life was full of variables and possibilities, and potential disasters that no amount of planning could completely eliminate. The question wasn't whether challenges would come. The question was whether facing those challenges was worth the price of freedom. The power came back on at 4:30 that afternoon, just as the electric company had predicted. I went through the house, turning off the candles I'd lit, checking to make sure everything was working properly, feeling grateful for the return of modern conveniences I usually took for granted. Sarah called that evening to make sure I was okay. "I'm fine," I told her. "The power's back on, no damage to the house, everything's back to normal." "I'm glad." But she didn't sound glad. She sounded almost disappointed that my night alone hadn't been the disaster she'd feared. "Sarah, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "When you were in law school, and you were struggling with that difficult constitutional law class, do you remember what I told you?" "Mom, I don't see what that has to do with anything." "You wanted to drop the class because it was too hard. You were afraid you might fail, afraid it might hurt your GPA, afraid it might affect your chances of getting into a good law firm after graduation." "I remember. And what did I tell you?" A long pause. "You told me that avoiding challenges wasn't the same as avoiding failure. I told you that the things worth having were usually the things that required some risk, some possibility of loss or disappointment. I told you that a life lived entirely in your comfort zone wasn't really much of a life at all." "That's different, Mom. That was about my career, my future. This is about my life, my future." "Why is it different when the person taking risks is 72 instead of 25? Another pause, longer this time. Because when you were 25, the consequences of failure weren't as serious, weren't they? If I'd failed to support you after your father died, if I'd failed to keep this house together, if I'd failed to help you through college and law school, wouldn't those consequences have been pretty serious? That's not the same thing. It's exactly the same thing. It's someone choosing to face challenges and accept risks. Because the alternative is giving up something important. We ended the conversation the way we'd been ending most of our conversations lately. With unresolved tension and the sense that we were talking past each other, instead of to each other. But something had shifted during my night without power. I'd proven to myself that I could handle unexpected challenges, that I had resources and capabilities Sarah couldn't see from her spreadsheets and statistics. More importantly, I'd been reminded that facing difficulties was part of what made life meaningful, that the storms we weather make us appreciate the calm that follows. I looked around my house, at the lights that were working again, at the refrigerator humming quietly in the kitchen, at all the familiar objects that had shared my night by candlelight. Everything was exactly as it should be, exactly where it belonged. Including me. 2 weeks after the storm, I was deadheading roses in my front garden when a car I didn't recognize pulled into my driveway. A man in his 60s got out, tall and distinguished looking, with silver hair and the kind of confident bearing that suggested he was used to being taken seriously. Mrs. Stone? I'm Judge Harrison Blackwell, retired. I'm a friend of your neighbor Dorothy Wilson. She suggested I might stop by and introduce myself. I straightened up, brushing dirt off my gardening gloves. Of course, Judge Blackwell. Dorothy mentioned you might be moving into the neighborhood. Actually, I moved in 3 weeks ago. The blue house at the end of the block. I've been meaning to introduce myself to all the neighbors. But I wanted to get settled first. He had a warm smile and an easy manner that put me immediately at ease. There was something about him that reminded me of James, not in looks, but in the way he seemed genuinely interested in what other people had to say. Would you like to come in for coffee? I heard myself ask. I'd like that very much, if you have the time. We settled at my kitchen table, and I found myself telling him about the storm, about the power outage, about how the neighborhood had come together to help each other through the inconvenience. He listened with the kind of attention that made me feel like what I was saying actually mattered. Dorothy tells me you're facing some pressure from your daughter about your living situation, he said after we'd covered the usual getting to know you topics. I felt my defenses go up immediately. Dorothy talks too much sometimes. She's worried about you, not about your capability to live independently, but about the stress this conflict is causing. It's causing stress for everyone involved. Family disputes usually do. I saw a lot of them during my years on the bench. Adult children who think they know what's best for their aging parents. Parents who resist any suggestion that they might need to modify their living arrangements. It's one of the most difficult situations families can face. Did you usually side with the children or the parents? He smiled. I usually sided with whoever had the law on their side. But the law doesn't always provide the best solutions for family conflicts. What does? Communication, compromise, a willingness to separate what we fear might happen from what's actually happening. I found myself telling him about Sarah's concerns, about the visit to Sunset Gardens, about the call to Adult Protective Services. Judge Blackwell listened without judgment, occasionally asking clarifying questions, treating my situation with the seriousness I felt it deserved. Your daughter sounds like she loves you very much, he said when I'd finished. That's what makes this so difficult. If she didn't care, I could just ignore her concerns and get on with my life. But because she cares, you feel obligated to consider her point of view, even when it conflicts with your own desires. Exactly. May I ask you something, Mrs. Stone? What would have to happen for you to voluntarily consider moving to a place like Sunset Gardens? I thought about it, really thought about it. For the first time since this whole situation had started. I suppose if I couldn't physically manage this house anymore, if I couldn't afford the upkeep, or if I became too frail to live safely alone. And how would you know if you'd reached that point? I think I'd know. I hope I'd know. But your daughter is afraid you wouldn't know. She's afraid you'd resist admitting you needed help until it was too late to make a graceful transition. He was right, and hearing it from someone who wasn't emotionally invested in the outcome made me see Sarah's fears in a different light. She may be right about that, I admitted. On the other hand, you're afraid that if you give in to her concerns now, while you're still capable of independent living, you'll be giving up something precious that you can never get back. Yes, you're both afraid of the same thing, really. You're both afraid of making a decision that turns out to be wrong. Judge Blackwell finished his coffee and leaned back in his chair. Mrs. Stone, would you be interested in a suggestion from someone who's dealt with similar situations? I'm listening. What if you could find a way to address your daughter's concerns without giving up your independence? What if there were a middle ground that provided some additional security without requiring you to move to institutional care? I'm not sure what you mean. There are options between living completely alone and living in a senior community. Home monitoring systems, regular check-ins from neighbors or friends, modifications to make your house safer for aging in place. Sometimes a small compromise can prevent a larger conflict. Sarah isn't interested in small compromises. She wants me to move, period. Sarah is interested in your safety. If you could demonstrate that you're taking reasonable precautions to address her concerns, she might be more willing to support your decision to stay here. I thought about what he was suggesting. It wasn't what I wanted to hear, that I might need to make changes. Accept help, acknowledge that I wasn't quite as independent as I'd been a few years ago. But it also wasn't what Sarah wanted to hear. That I was completely unable to care for myself and needed institutional supervision. What kind of compromises are you talking about? A medical alert system, maybe. Regular visits from a cleaning service. Someone to help with yard work or major household maintenance. Small changes that provide peace of mind, without dramatically altering your daily life. And you think that would satisfy Sarah? I think it would give her less ammunition for her arguments, and give you more credibility when you insist you can live independently. We talked for another hour, and by the time Judge Blackwell left, I felt like I had a clearer understanding of the situation and some possible paths forward. He wasn't just offering legal advice. He was offering the kind of wisdom that comes from years of watching people try to solve problems they couldn't solve by fighting about them. That evening, I called Sarah. Mom, is everything okay? You don't usually call in the evening. Everything's fine. I wanted to talk to you about our situation. What about it? I've been thinking about your concerns, and I want to find a way to address them without giving up my home. Silence on the other end of the line. I could practically hear her trying to figure out if this was a trap. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting we look for some middle ground. Some changes I could make that would provide additional safety and security, without requiring me to move to institutional care. What kind of changes? I don't know yet. That's what I'd like to discuss with you. Mom, we've been through this. The house is too big, too expensive, too much for you to handle alone. Maybe, but what if it wasn't? What if we could address the specific problems without throwing away everything that's working well? Another pause, longer this time. Are you talking about making modifications to the house? I'm talking about being open to changes that make sense, that actually solve problems, instead of just making problems go away by pretending they don't exist. I don't understand the difference. The difference is between helping me live better in my own home and forcing me to give up my home because someone else thinks it's too complicated for me to manage. We talked for 45 minutes, the longest conversation we'd had in months. That didn't end with one of us hanging up in frustration. Sarah was skeptical, suspicious of my sudden willingness to consider changes, but also hopeful that we might find a solution that didn't require us to choose between her peace of mind and my autonomy. I'll do some research, she said finally. There are companies that specialize in aging-in-place modifications and services that provide support for seniors who want to remain in their homes. I'd appreciate that. But Mom, this only works if you're genuinely willing to make changes. If this is just a way to stall while you dig in your heels even more, it's not going to solve anything. I understand. And if we try this approach and it doesn't work out, if you still can't manage safely, then we're back to discussing Sunset Gardens. It wasn't the unconditional acceptance I wanted, but it was better than the ultimatum I'd been facing. I understand that too. After we hung up, I walked through my house, looking at it with new eyes. What would it take to make this place safer, more manageable, more suitable for an aging woman living alone? Some of the changes would be cosmetic. Better lighting, grab bars in the bathroom, non-slip surfaces in potentially dangerous areas. Others would be more significant, updating the electrical system, improving the heating and cooling, maybe even reconfiguring some rooms to make daily living easier. The changes would cost money, but probably less money than several years at Sunset Gardens. They would require me to admit that I was getting older, that my needs were changing, that perfect independence was a myth I needed to give up. But they wouldn't require me to give up the life I'd built, the community I belonged to, the sense of home that no institutional care could replicate. It wasn't the solution I'd wanted, but it was a solution I could live with. Literally, for the first time in months, I felt hopeful about the future. Not because the future would be exactly what I wanted, but because it might be something both Sarah and I could accept, something that honored both her love and my independence. Outside, Judge Blackwell was working in his garden, planting what looked like late-season vegetables. When he saw me at the window, he waved. I waved back, grateful for neighbors who understood that sometimes the best help comes from people who listen without trying to solve your problems for you. Sometimes the best solutions come from admitting that the problem is more complicated than either side wants to acknowledge, and that the answer might require everyone involved to give up something they thought was non-negotiable. The modifications began 3 weeks later, after Sarah had researched companies, and I'd gotten estimates, and we'd had several careful conversations about what changes would actually improve my safety versus what changes would just make her feel better about my situation. The first crew arrived on a Monday morning to install better lighting throughout the house, motion sensors for the hallways and stairwell, and grab bars in both bathrooms. I'd been dreading this part, the invasion of strangers, with tools and opinions about what an elderly woman needed to live safely. But the crew chief, a woman named Maria Santos, who looked about 40 and had clearly done this kind of work before, treated me with the kind of respectful professionalism that made me feel like a client rather than a charity case. "Mrs. Stone, we're going to try to minimize the disruption to your daily routine," she said as her team unloaded equipment. "Most of what we're doing today won't require us to turn off power or water, so you can go about your normal activities. I appreciate that. I also want you to know that if anything we install doesn't feel right to you, if it's in the wrong place, or doesn't work the way you expected, we can adjust it. This is your home, and the modifications should work for your lifestyle. Not some generic idea of what seniors need." It was a small thing, but it made an enormous difference in how I felt about the process. These people weren't here to transform my house into a medical facility. They were here to help me live more safely in the home I already loved. The lighting improvements were dramatic and immediate. The new fixtures were brighter without being harsh, and the motion sensors meant I never had to navigate dark hallways or fumble for light switches. The grab bars in the bathrooms were positioned exactly where I would naturally reach for support, and they were attractive enough that they didn't make my house look like a hospital room. "You know what I like about these modifications?" Dorothy Wilson said when she stopped by to see the changes. "They're the kind of things that make sense for anyone, not just old people. Better lighting, safer bathrooms, more convenient switches. I might get some of this stuff done at my place." She was right. The changes didn't scream, "Elderly woman lives here alone." They just made the house more functional, more comfortable, easier to navigate safely. The bigger modifications took longer. The electrician who updated my system found wiring that had been installed in the 1980s and really did need to be replaced. The heating and cooling company recommended a more efficient unit that would reduce my utility bills and provide better temperature control. None of these improvements were cheap, but they were investments in the long-term viability of my home, not just accommodations for my age. Sarah drove down from Des Moines to see the work in progress, and I could tell she was surprised by how thoughtfully everything had been planned. "This motion sensor light in the basement is brilliant," she said, testing the system by walking down the stairs. "No more worrying about you trying to navigate those steps in the dark." "It's practical," I said, using her favorite word. "Very practical. And this new thermostat, you can program it to maintain consistent temperatures." And it has a remote monitoring feature. So you can call for service if something goes wrong. We walked through the house together, examining each modification, discussing how it would improve safety or convenience. For the first time in months, we were having a conversation about my future that felt collaborative rather than adversarial. Mom, I have to admit, I'm impressed. This isn't what I expected when you said you wanted to stay here. What did you expect? I expected you to make a few token changes, and then insist that everything was fine. But this is actually addressing the real concerns. That was the point. The most significant change was also the most controversial. At least between Sarah and me. I'd decided to convert the formal dining room, which I rarely used, into a first-floor bedroom and bathroom suite. It was a major renovation, but it meant I wouldn't have to navigate stairs every day. And it would provide a comfortable living space if I ever became temporarily or permanently unable to use the second floor. Are you sure about this? Sarah asked, as we watched the contractors remove the dining room wallpaper that had been hanging since 1995. It's going to completely change the character of this floor. The character of this floor should be that it's functional for the person who lives here. But the dining room has so many memories. Remember all the holiday dinners, the birthday celebrations, the homework sessions at that big table? I did remember, and giving up that space wasn't easy. But holding onto a room I never used just because it held memories seemed less important than creating a space I could actually live in as I aged. The memories aren't in the wallpaper, Sarah. They're in us. The renovation took 6 weeks, and when it was finished, I had a beautiful suite with a bedroom, bathroom, and small sitting area that opened onto the kitchen. I could live entirely on the first floor if necessary. But I could also continue using the upstairs bedrooms and my home office when I felt like climbing the stairs. It's like having the best of both worlds, Judge Blackwell observed when I gave him a tour of the completed work. Independence with options, that's exactly what it is. But the physical modifications were only part of the compromise I'd worked out with Sarah. I'd also agreed to a medical alert system, weekly visits from a cleaning service, and quarterly checkups with my doctor instead of the annual visits I'd been getting away with. The medical alert system was a small device I wore around my neck, connected to a monitoring service that could summon help if I had a fall or medical emergency. I'd resisted it initially because it seemed like admitting I was frail and vulnerable. But the customer service representative who came to set it up changed my perspective. Mrs. Stone, think of this like car insurance, she said. You don't buy car insurance because you're a bad driver. You buy it because other people are unpredictable. And accidents happen to good drivers too. I never thought of it that way. Most of our customers are active, independent people who just want some backup security. Last week, we helped a 70-year-old marathon runner who had a heart episode during her morning run. The device probably saved her life, and she was back to running within a month. The weekly cleaning service was actually more of a luxury than a necessity. But it freed up time and energy for activities I enjoyed more than scrubbing bathrooms. Rosa, the woman who came every Thursday, was efficient and respectful. And she had a way of cleaning that enhanced rather than disrupted my daily routines. Mrs. Stone, you keep a beautiful home, she said after her first visit. I'm just here to help maintain what you've already created. The quarterly doctor visits were probably the smartest change I made, even though they required me to acknowledge that my health needed more attention than it had a few years ago. Dr. Martinez, my longtime physician, was pleased with the more frequent checkups. This is exactly the kind of preventive approach that helps people age successfully in their own homes. She told me during my first quarterly visit, we can catch small problems before they become big ones, adjust medications as needed, and make sure you're getting the support you need to maintain your independence. 6 months after the modifications were complete, Sarah and I had settled into a new rhythm of communication. She called twice a week instead of every day, and our conversations focused more on what I was doing than on what I should be doing differently. Mom, you sound really good, she said during one of our evening calls. Relaxed. Happy. I am happy. And I think you're less worried about me, which makes me happy too. I have to admit, I sleep better at night, knowing you have that alert system and the weekly check-ins with Rosa. And I sleep better knowing that you're not lying awake, planning my institutional care. We both laughed, and it felt like the first completely genuine moment we'd shared in months. I owe you an apology, Sarah said suddenly. For what? For calling Adult Protective Services. For going behind your back instead of talking to you directly about my fears. For treating you like you weren't capable of making rational decisions about your own life. The apology meant more to me than all the modifications and compromises combined. You were scared. People do things they regret when they're scared. I was scared, but that doesn't excuse it. You deserved better from me. We both deserved better. From ourselves and from each other. That conversation marked a turning point in our relationship. We still didn't agree about everything. But we'd learned to disagree without questioning each other's fundamental competence or love. The changes I'd made to my house and my lifestyle weren't just about appeasing Sarah's concerns. They were about taking an honest look at my own aging process and making proactive choices instead of reactive ones. I was still living independently, still making my own decisions, still connected to the community and neighbors I cared about. But I was doing all of that with better safety nets, more support, and more realistic expectations about what I could and couldn't manage alone. Judge Blackwell had been right about the value of middle ground. By giving up some things I could afford to lose perfect independence, complete privacy. The illusion that aging didn't require adjustments. I'd been able to keep the things that mattered most: my home, my autonomy, my dignity, and my relationship with my daughter. 3 months later, Dorothy Wilson fell in her kitchen and broke her hip. The accident happened on a Tuesday morning, while I was watering my garden, and I heard her calling for help through our shared fence. Dorothy, are you okay? Maggie, I think I've hurt myself pretty badly. Can you call 911? I used my medical alert device to summon an ambulance, then went to Dorothy's house with my spare key to stay with her until the paramedics arrived. She was conscious and alert, but clearly in significant pain. This is exactly what Sarah was afraid of happening to you, Dorothy said as we waited for help. I know. Are you glad you made all those modifications now? I was glad I made them before this happened to you. Now I'm really glad. The ambulance arrived within 6 minutes, and Dorothy was taken to the hospital for surgery. Her recovery took 8 weeks, and during that time, I found myself thinking often about the difference between preparation and paranoia, between reasonable caution and paralyzing fear. If I hadn't made the changes to my house and lifestyle, Dorothy's accident would have reinforced all of Sarah's arguments about the dangers of aging in place. But because I had made those changes, the incident became proof that it was possible to age safely at home with proper support and planning. When Dorothy came home from her rehabilitation stay, she asked me to help her research modifications for her own house. I don't want to move to some institutional place, she said. But I don't want to fall again either. What you did with your house, that's what I want to do with mine. It's not about admitting defeat, I told her. It's about adapting to change instead of pretending change isn't happening. Exactly. I want to stay in control of my life, but I also want to be smart about it. 6 months later, Dorothy's house had been modified with many of the same safety features I'd installed in mine. Judge Blackwell decided to make some preventive changes to his house as well, even though he was younger and more robust than either Dorothy or me. This is becoming a very sensibly aging-friendly neighborhood, he observed during one of our regular coffee conversations. We're creating a model for how people can support each other in aging in place successfully. He was right. Our block had become an informal network of neighbors who looked out for each other without being intrusive, who shared resources and information, who had figured out how to balance independence with community support. It wasn't the solution Sarah had originally envisioned for my future, and it wasn't the complete autonomy I'd originally insisted I needed, but it was something better than either of those extremes. It was a way of living that honored both the realities of aging and the importance of choice, both the value of security and the necessity of freedom. Most importantly, it was mine. My choice, my home, my life, lived on my own terms, but with the wisdom to adapt those terms as circumstances required. The house still creaked in winter storms, still needed occasional repairs, still held all the memories I'd accumulated over 34 years of living within these walls. But now it also held the promise that I could continue living here safely And comfortably for as long as I wanted to. As long as I was willing to keep growing and changing along with the challenges that life would inevitably bring. That seemed like a pretty good compromise to me. 1 year after the modifications were complete, Sarah suggested we have Thanksgiving dinner at my house instead of in Des Moines, as we'd done for the past several years. Are you sure? I asked. That's a lot of work, and your kitchen is so much bigger than mine. Mom, I want to come home for Thanksgiving. Really home. And I want Marcus to see what you've created here. How well you're managing, how beautiful this place is. It was the first time in years that Sarah had referred to my house as home, instead of the house or your place. And the significance of that small word change wasn't lost on either of us. I'd love to have you here for Thanksgiving. We spent the holiday weekend together, cooking in my updated kitchen, eating at the table in my former dining room, which now served as a breakfast nook and casual dining area, walking through the neighborhood, so I could introduce Marcus to my network of friends and neighbors. This isn't what I expected, Marcus admitted as we strolled past Judge Blackwell's house on Saturday morning. What did you expect? Based on Sarah's descriptions from last year, I expected to find you isolated and struggling in a house that was too big and too much work. Instead, I find you thriving in a home that's perfectly suited to your needs, surrounded by people who clearly care about you. Last year, Sarah's descriptions were accurate. This year, they wouldn't be. What changed? I thought about how to answer that question. What had changed wasn't just the physical modifications to my house or the support services I'd added to my routine. What had changed was my understanding of what independence actually meant. I learned the difference between being independent and being isolated. I said finally. I learned that accepting help doesn't mean giving up control. And that growing older doesn't mean giving up the right to make choices about my own life. And Sarah learned? Sarah learned that loving someone doesn't give you the right to make their decisions for them, but it does give you the right to express your concerns and expect them to be taken seriously. That evening, as Sarah and Marcus were getting ready to drive back to Des Moines, Sarah pulled me aside for a private conversation. Mom, I owe you more than just the apology I gave you last year. What do you mean? I owe you credit for being wiser than I gave you credit for. When you resisted my suggestions about moving to Sunset Gardens, I thought you were being stubborn and unrealistic. But you were actually being strategic. You knew that if you gave in to my fears too quickly, you'd end up giving up more than you needed to give up. I was scared too, you know. Scared that if I made any compromises, you'd see them as proof that you were right about everything. And I was scared that if I didn't push hard enough, you'd end up in a dangerous situation that could have been prevented. We were both scared of losing something important. The difference is, you found a way to address my fears without giving up what was important to you. I was asking you to give up what was important to you to address my fears. Sarah hugged me, and it felt different from the dutiful hugs we'd been exchanging for months. It felt like the embrace of two adults who had worked through a difficult problem and found their way back to mutual respect and genuine affection. After they left, I walked through my house, looking at all the changes that had been made over the past year. The first-floor bedroom suite that had become my favorite space. The improved lighting that made everything safer and more beautiful. The medical alert device that I barely noticed wearing anymore. The weekly visits from Rosa that had become something I looked forward to rather than endured. These modifications hadn't diminished my independence, they had enhanced it. They had given me more options, not fewer. They had allowed me to stay in my home, while acknowledging that staying required some adaptations. In my kitchen, I made a cup of tea and sat down with the photo album Sarah had wanted to throw away a year ago. The pictures were still there, still telling the story of a family that had grown and changed and faced challenges together. But now the album held new meaning. Looking at the photo of 8-year-old Sarah with her Sarah's house sign, I realized that she'd been right about ownership and belonging. But she'd been wrong about what ownership required. Owning a life, like owning a house, meant being responsible for its maintenance and care. But it also meant having the right to modify, improve, and adapt that life as circumstances changed. I'd spent most of the past year learning how to do that. How to maintain ownership of my life, while accepting that ownership sometimes required changes I didn't initially want to make. The phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. It was Judge Blackwell, calling to invite me to a neighborhood potluck dinner. He and Dorothy were organizing for the following weekend. We thought it would be nice to get everyone together. Before the weather gets too cold for outdoor gatherings, he said. Dorothy's making her famous apple crisp, and I'm providing the main course. Would you be interested in contributing something? I'd be delighted. What can I bring? Whatever you'd like. The goal is just to spend time together, to celebrate what we've built here. What we'd built here. A community of people who had chosen to age in place thoughtfully. Who had found ways to support each other without sacrificing individual autonomy. Who had proven that growing older didn't require giving up everything that made life worth living. After I hung up, I realized that this was what I'd been fighting for all along. Even when I couldn't articulate it clearly. Not the right to pretend I wasn't getting older. Not the right to refuse all help and support. But the right to age on my own terms in a place that felt like home. Hi, my name is Margaret Stone. I live in Cedar Falls, Iowa. A year ago, I thought my story might be ending. That the choices about my future were being made by other people. Who loved me but didn't understand what I needed. Today, I know that my story is still being written. Still full of possibilities and challenges and opportunities to grow and change. I'm still living in my own house. Still making my own decisions, still connected to the people and places that give my life meaning. But I'm doing all of that more safely, more thoughtfully. And with better support than I had before. I've learned that independence isn't about doing everything alone. It's about having the power to choose how you want to live. And who you want to accept help from. My relationship with my daughter isn't perfect. But it's honest and respectful in ways it wasn't a year ago. We've both learned that love sometimes requires difficult conversations, uncomfortable compromises, and the courage to admit when you're wrong. Most importantly, we've both learned that there's usually a middle ground. Between the extremes that initially seem like the only options. Between complete independence and institutional care. Between ignoring problems and surrendering control. Between protecting someone and respecting their autonomy. I don't know what challenges the future will bring, what adaptations I'll need to make. As I continue aging, what decisions I'll face about my home. And my health and my relationships. But I know that those decisions will be mine to make, informed by the people who love me. But not controlled by their fears or expectations. This house still creaks in winter storms, still needs occasional repairs. Still holds 35 years of memories in every room and corner. But now it also holds the promise that home is something you can modify and improve. Without losing its essential character. I'm Margaret Stone. I live in Cedar Falls, Iowa, in a house I've made my own through decades of love, loss, challenge, and change. And this is my story, not the story of someone whose best years are behind her. But the story of someone who's still writing new chapters, still learning, still growing. Still choosing how to live each day. That seems like a pretty good story to me. And it's far from over.